All right, let's turn in our Bibles to Genesis chapter 31. Again, Genesis chapter 31, beginning in verse 1. As we get started, let's read the text together. Again, Genesis chapter 31, beginning in verse number 1. Now Jacob heard that the sons of Laban were saying, Jacob has taken all that was our father's, and from what was our father's he has gained all this wealth. And Jacob saw that Laban did not regard him with favor as before. Then the Lord said to Jacob, return to the land of your fathers and to your kindred, and I will be with you. So Jacob sent and called Rachel and Leah into the field to his flock and said to them, I see that your father does not regard me with favor as he did before, but the God of my father has been with me. You know that I have served your father with all my strength, yet your father has cheated me and changed my wages 10 times. But God did not permit him to harm me. If he said, the spotted shall be your wages, then all the flock bore spotted. And if he said, the striped shall be your wages, then all the flock bore striped. Thus God has taken away the livestock of your father and given them to me. In the breeding season of the flock, I lifted up my eyes and saw in a dream that the goats that were mating with the flock were striped, spotted, and mottled. Then the angel of God said to me in the dream, Jacob. And I said, here I am. And he said, lift up your eyes and see. All the goats that mate with the flock are striped, spotted, and mottled. For I have seen all that Laban is doing to you. I am the God of Bethel, where you anointed a pillar and made a vow to me. Now rise, go out from this land and return to the land of your kindred. Then Rachel and Leah answered and said to him, is there any portion or inheritance left to us in our father's house? Are we not regarded by him as foreigners? For he has sold us, and he has indeed devoured our money. All the wealth that God has taken away from our father belongs to us and to our children. Now then, whatever God has said to you, do. What we're seeing here, as we've been studying over the last number of weeks, deals with this particular period of time in Jacob's life. If you remember, Jacob had left his homeland there in Beersheba after his father Isaac had told him to leave and go find a wife. And if you'll recall, his mother had warned him to flee. Why? Because of the conflict between Jacob and his brother Esau. So Jacob, along the way to Mesopotamia, spends the night, and we remember he has a dream, right? Looked at that in Genesis chapter 28, the dream of a ladder. And remember, what were the angels doing? They were going up and coming down. And the presence of the Lord was there. And that's really, I think, the great reality of the entire Bible, that the Lord is present with his people. Jacob eventually arrives in Mesopotamia, and he meets the younger daughter of Laban. Rachel is her name, and he desires to marry her. But Laban says, hey, you need to work with me for how many years? 7 years, and then you can marry her. He does that, and he says the time was what? Went by quickly, right? Because of how excited he was to marry this daughter. Again, he worked for 7 years. It's time to marry her, and yet then he's tricked by his father-in-law. His father-in-law gives him Leah not Rachel, to marry. And then his father-in-law, Laban, says, if you want to marry Rachel, you'll need to work for me how many more years? Another 7 years. And so he does that, and now we're at 14 years. Then after that, Laban says, why don't you stay and continue to work for me? And now we're 6 more years into that. So that is a total of how many years? 20 years. 20 years that Jacob has now been in Mesopotamia. And he's there because he was initially tricked by Laban. He thought he was going to marry Rachel. He gets Leah instead. The deceiver Jacob was deceived. It's quite an interesting twist that we have witnessed over the last several weeks. When you look at Jacob's life, what he has done in previous years kind of has come full circle, has it not? When you come to chapter 31, you see Jacob and Laban's relationship is in conflict. We're going to look at that in detail here this morning, and eventually it will lead to their separation. So 16 verses that I read for you just a few moments ago. We're going to look at these together this morning in some detail. And the theme, I think, that you could surround this with, the theme would be going home. Going home. Because that's really what's happening here. The Lord is calling Jacob to go home. And as we walk through these 16 verses, I want to give you some words to remember, some headings to kind of help us as we flow through what is this narrative taking place here. The first word that I want to talk about with you for just a few moments is the word conflict. Let me ask you, class, how many of you have ever had conflict? Yeah, that probably, like last night's NASCAR race. How many of you weren't involved in a wreck? There was only 4 cars in that entire field that hadn't been wrecked by the end of that night at some point. So they said on the thing, let's just talk about who hasn't been involved in a wreck, and there was 4. So in this room, how many of you have never been involved in a conflict? I don't see any hands. All right. First, jot down, if you take notes, that word conflict. And we're going to see it in verse 1 and 2, really. Again, let's look at that verse again. It says, now Jacob heard that the sons of Laban were saying, Jacob has taken all that was our father's, and from what was our father's, he has gained all his wealth, this wealth. In your own words, class, what do you think they're saying right here? They're taking their pockets. Look, they're taking their pockets out of their pants and going, look, we don't have any money. He's gotten it all, right? What you really see, though, in verse 1 is a family that is unraveling. Laban's sons are really and truly tired of Jacob being around. They feel like because of his success, the success that he is having in his work, that he's taking away money from their father, and in so doing, ultimately taking money away from them, right? Now, let me say this. The accusations here aren't really true, because the reality is Laban is the one who was setting the rules. We looked last week at the kind of strange passage with the animals and the different things that were going on. It was Laban who was setting forth the ground rules for what animals who would belong to whom. In fact, we know that something takes place here in verse 2. It says, Jacob saw that Laban did not regard him with favor as before. What does that mean? What does it mean when it says that Laban does not regard him with favor as before? Let's talk about the last half of that verse first. What does that mean? Wasn't friendly toward him? Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Would it surprise you to know that the literal Hebrew here would tell us that Laban's face turned? Laban's face turned. It's not so much what Laban was saying to Jacob as much as his body language had changed. Let me ask you, when somebody is upset at you, do they always have to say something for you to know that they're upset at you? No. There were times as a kid I could walk into the house and see my mom, and she didn't have to say a word. I just knew that I had done something wrong. I mean, she could be in the kitchen cooking, and I hear her banging around in there, and I'm like, oh, I did something. Yeah, am I alone in that? Anybody else have that experience? You can do that with Pam. You can come in the house and know she's not happy with you. She didn't have to say a word, does she? Yeah, that look, it's telling, isn't it? Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I'm telling you, you just know when someone's upset. They don't always have to say something. It's a change in their eyes. It's a change in their expression. It's a change in their countenance. Something is different when you encounter them. And that's what the text is really saying in verse 2. He didn't regard him with favor. His face turned against Jacob. All the years of work is beginning to fall apart. And I do think, and I'll just put a pin in this for when we get to it in the text in a couple of weeks. Genesis chapter 32 and verse 30. You can cheat and look ahead of that if you want to. But it will specifically mention that God has set his face upon Jacob. And I want you to remember that reference when we see it in a few weeks. What's important for you to understand, class, is that here in chapter 31, Laban's face is turned against Jacob. And yet it does not matter because the face of the Lord shines with favor upon his people. There are going to be times when your friends, their face is going to turn against you. Is that true? There's going to be times when your employer, their face turns against you. There are going to be times when people in your life, can even include your own spouse, I've seen it happen, when their face can turn against you. But for those who belong to the Lord, his face, his favor is always upon you. That's our comfort. Not that we really need the rest of the world to look at us with favor, do we? I mean, the whole world could look at us and turn their face from us, but as long as God's face is still toward us, we still are in good shape. But the conflict is brewing. The brother-in-laws are frustrated. The father-in-law is frustrated. And that conflict gives way and brings us to our second word, and that's this word call. C-A-L-L, call. This is the call that comes from the Lord to Jacob. We read it in verse 3. It says, "Then the Lord said to Jacob." By the way, that word Lord there translated as what? Yahweh. This is the personal, covenantal name of God. You can know God. He's not just some way out there deity. He's not just a power. No, He's a God who can be known. And whatever is going on in the life of Jacob, yet God is faithful. And I think that's amazing. And the same is true for you and me. The Lord cares for you. The Lord reveals Himself to you and makes Himself known to you. The Lord, Yahweh, says here to Jacob, "Return to the land of your fathers and to your kindred, and I will be with you." Now, I think it's interesting, if you are familiar with the chapters that we've been walking through over the last several weeks, God's call here for Jacob to go back home in chapter 31, the timing of it is really interesting. The timing of God's call for Jacob to go back home, I think, is at least materialistically, it's an interesting timing, because things at this point are going really well for Jacob. I mean, we've seen, right? God has blessed him with his flocks, and whether it's spotted or striped or mottled, whatever it's been, God has blessed him. He stayed there. He worked for 7 years. He got tricked. He stayed there for 7 more years. He married Rachel. He stayed there for 6 more years. And now it has turned into 2 decades that he's been here. But if you were just to look at things that could be measured, it's a bit strange. It's a bit of a strange time for God to call him home, because at this point things are going pretty well. I mean, true relationally, what's happening relationally? It's falling apart. But at this point in his life, guess what? Jacob has 11 sons. He has wealth. He has family. He has resources. In a material sense, he's got a lot of things. And the truth of the matter is, the increase in his wealth is not really because of tricks or strategies. Ultimately, his growth, his wealth, is because of God's grace. God's favor has been with him. Because of it, he prospered. Now, you might ask yourself, why didn't God call him to return home earlier? Maybe call him to return home when life was harder. But before things were kind of going well from a business sense, God allowed him to stay while things were difficult. And now that things, at least materialistically, in that sense, are going well, now why the call to go back home? Think about it. Because I think you can relate. There have been times in my life, and I would assume yours as well, where God has brought you into a season of struggle in your life. And you thought to yourself and you prayed, "Lord God, would you please take me out of this? This hurts. This is painful. I don't like being here. Lord, get me out of this situation. God, would you fix this? Would you intervene?" And God just decided to leave you there. And then maybe once you got through the hardship, the tough times, whatever the struggle may have been, then God calls you somewhere else. And then you're left going, "Wait a second, God, this timing is really off. I mean, I asked you to deliver me out of this situation when things were hard and tough, but now things are actually okay. Now, God, why are you calling me out of this?" We don't always understand that, do we? And I think, of course, there's a reason for that. That there are things that God expects us to learn, to grow from through the trial that we are facing. And if every time we got in the midst of a tough period of life, a valley of our life, if every time we got into that valley, God just called us out of that valley immediately upon the first sign of struggle, then we're not learning many lessons from those signs of struggle, are we? So I believe God has a reason. We have to be tested. We have to be stretched. You know it hurts, right? I think about this for Jacob. I think about the reasoning by the timing of this call. Do you think it's possible that Jacob may, at this point in 20 years, have become a little bit too comfortable being away from home? Maybe Jacob's in danger of losing that kind of pilgrim status that his father and grandfather had had. I mean, this was originally, if you think about it, this was only supposed to be a short trip, right? I'm going to leave and I'm going to go find a what? A wife. And it turned into year after year, and Jacob maybe is in danger of forgetting where his heart should be and where his heart should belong. And so God is going to call him, it's time to come home. Maybe Jacob thought, I'm going to take a few weeks, a few months, maybe even a year, find a wife, get married, and come back home. And now 20 years have passed. Let's do this together. What were you doing 20 years ago? Think about where you were 20 years ago today. Where were you? Just stop. Think about it. 20 years. Am I right? Goes quick, doesn't it? Now, when you're in the middle of those 20 years, it seems like at times it drags on, right? Especially if there are some valleys in the midst of that 20-year period. But when you're on this side of 20 years, you look back and it just feels like, and that's really where we're at here with Jacob. I mean, he thought, I'm going to leave, I'm going to find me a wife, I'm going to skip out of town for a while, things are going to settle down with my brother, and then I'm back home. 20 years have passed. But now the Lord has called him, and it's finally time to come back home. And ultimately, to make a sense, I think, of the timeline of this, yes, it's true that Jacob in chapter 30 was ready to go home. And yes, his brothers-in-law have turned against him. And yes, his father-in-law has now turned against him. Ultimately, though, it's not time to go home because his brothers-in-law are against him. It's not time for him to go home just because his father-in-law is against him. It's time to go home. Why? Because God has called him to come home. You got any questions on that? Our third word I want to talk about for a few moments this morning is the word comfort. Comfort. And we see this at the end of verse 3. Return to the land of your fathers and to your kindred. Now here's the comfort. And what? And I will be with you. That is really all that Jacob needs to know. And my friends, my brethren, that's really all you need to know. That wherever you go, whatever peak or valley you are in at the moment, the best knowledge you can have is to know that God is with you. That He will not leave you, that He will not forsake you. It reminds me of my favorite story of the Old Testament that we've studied through twice since I've been here. I couldn't just do it once. I had to do it twice. And that's really the Old Testament narrative about Ruth and Boaz. I mean, before you have Ruth and Boaz, you back up to that family and you first have who? Naomi and Elimelech, right? And the great story or narrative that is Ruth and Boaz actually begins with Naomi and Elimelech doing what they maybe shouldn't have done. They were dwelling in the land that God had given them, and a drought had come, and so they leave their land, the land of promise, and go where? Moab, a godless place. And if you read the text, they thought, well, we're just going to go and let things die down, and then we'll quickly be back home, right? Is that the way it worked out? No. And they, we know that Naomi comes back home, but if you remember in our study of Ruth, she comes back home a far different lady than she was when they left. You remember what she said? She comes back home and the people look at her and they say, hey, isn't that Naomi? And by the way, the name Naomi meant what? Pleasant. Isn't this a pleasant lady? And she says, don't you dare call me pleasant. Call me what? Mara, which means bitter. For she said, the Lord has dealt bitterly with me. I just think that sometimes is true of us as Christians today. We dabble in sin. We don't plan to do it very long. We think, well, I'm just going to sin this little bit and then I'm going to pull myself out of it. I have never met anybody that I've worked with who went through addiction. I've never met anybody that didn't say, I thought I could do it and it really wouldn't get hold of me. Alcoholism. I've never known anybody that struggled as an alcoholic who didn't say to themselves in the beginning, I can control this. It's not a problem. You think about the opioid epidemic in our country. You think about all the other drugs that are affecting young people today. If you let your guard down, right? If you let your guard down and you dabble in those things, can they not take hold of you? But it's that way with sin. It's that way with sin. How many times over the last 48 years of my life have I known people who became frustrated with their spouse? And they think, well, I'm just going to go a few places and look at a few things and have a few conversations that I really shouldn't have. But, I'm so frustrated with my wife or with my husband. I'm just going to do this because I need this. I need to feel this. And so they do that. And then what happens? They throw their marriage away many times. And then people wake up one day and look at their life and say, this is who I've become. This is who I am. And I think you've got to confess and admit that these are things that I've done that have caused me to wander so far away from home. And it's very hard to go back home. I remember leaving home, going off to college, preaching, and then trying to come back home again. No, hard to come back home. And yet here, what we witness, it's going to be hard for Jacob to go back home. But there's comfort for Jacob in knowing that he can go back home. Why? Because God is with him. Yeah, he made that deal with God, right? Remember that deal that Jacob made? If you'll be with me, if you'll bless me, then I will, All right, our fourth word, it's an interesting word, and I struggled to try to find another C word. It's the word conference. Conference. C-O-N-F-E-R-E-N-C. Conference. And really, if you're asking me what's that all about, it's what takes place in the field between Jacob, Rachel, and Leah. They have a conference here. And the conflict, as we know, exists between Jacob and his brothers-in-law and his father-in-law. The call comes from God. The comfort is that the Lord will be with him. And then verses 4 to 13, we have this conference. Look at verse 4. So Jacob sent and called Rachel and Leah to his flock in the field. I want you to answer me this question, class. Why did Jacob call Rachel and Leah to come to where he is at in the field? Why do you think he called them to meet him out there? Privacy. There you go. Because you don't want somebody overhearing what you're going to talk about. If you're talking about leaving, you don't know whose tent, you don't want them to hear you, right? And those tents, by the way, had thin walls, apparently, because you remember what we talked about this morning? Yeah. I think that Jacob here doesn't know. I don't think he knows for sure when he calls Rachel and Leah to come meet him in this field. I don't think he knows for sure how they're going to respond to him. Do you think that? And he begins to show this contrast between how Laban has treated him. And I don't want you to miss what I'm about to share with you. There's a contrast between how Laban is treating Jacob, the father-in-law, right? There's a contrast between the way Laban, the father-in-law, is treating him versus how God, the Father, is treating him. Do you see what I mean by that? There is a sense of the presence of God that Jacob relies on. Look at verse 7. What does it say there? Your father has what? Cheated me and changed my wages, not once, not twice, not 3 times, not 4, not 5, not 6, not 7, not 8, not 9. How many times? 10 times. But God, those are some powerful words right there, right? But God did not permit him to harm me. He gives protection to Jacob, right? Verse number 9, thus God has taken away the livestock of your father and given them to me. In other words, God gives provision to Jacob. He says, your father has tried to turn against me. Your father has tried to steal from me. And yet God is my protector and God is my provider and God is giving me provision for everything that I need. Laban keeps changing the rules, but God keeps blessing Jacob anyway. Isn't that just like God, though? They say, listen, the world can do and say whatever they want, but God's truth, what? Just keeps marching on, right? I mean, think about all the times throughout history, from the first century onward to today, where we read about how people have tried to persecute Christians. What happens to the church historically during times of persecution? You know what happens? It grew. It grows. It doesn't make it easy. It just shows that God is so faithful. What we're seeing here is just like God to do this. And I guess if you want to know, let me share with you a great lesson here, is that no trial is wasted on the people of God. Because God is sovereign even over whatever your struggle may be this morning. In verses 10 to 12, Jacob, is having this conference with Rachel and Leah here in the field, and he begins to recite this kind of strange thing, doesn't he? We talked about it a little bit last week. I mentioned last week, I'll say it again, it's not about strategy. It wasn't about superstition. This isn't a story about genetic engineering. It's not even ultimately a story about habits or practices. What is this narrative all about? This is a narrative about the sovereign God saying, I can choose to bless what? Anybody I want to. And so he tells them what happened. And it ends in verse 12. The Lord says, I have seen all that you have gone through. Verse 13, I am the God of Bethel, where you anointed a pillar and made a vow to me. Now arise, go out from this land and return to the land of your kindred. 3, count them, 1, 2, 3. 3 imperatives in verse 13. What are they? First one is, arise, get up. The second is, go out. And the third is, return. Get up, get going, and finish the task. And I think the reminder here is that sometimes, and I'm just asking you, do we ever sometimes become spiritually lethargic? Is it possible that even churches sometimes become spiritually lethargic? Sometimes exhausted, sometimes confused, sometimes beat up, so that we just lay and kind of mire in our spiritual lethargic state. And it's at that moment when the Lord says, it's time to wake up, get up, and go out and finish what I've asked you to do. It reminds me of what's spoken in Revelation to the 7 churches of Asia Minor, right? Return to your first love, right? Or just go back home and get back to what really matters. And you just can't help but see that even though the way Laban has treated Jacob for 20 years has been difficult. I mean, the text tells us how many times again has Laban changed his wages? 10 times. And when you read that, don't think to yourself, those 10, because I know I've done this. When I read this the first time, I thought he changed his wages 10 times. That means he gave him a raise 10 times. That ain't what happened. I mean, think about if your boss came to you and said, hey, I want to hire you. Okay, great. What's my salary? Here's your salary. And then he comes back to you a month later and says, hey, I'm sorry, I'm not going to pay you what I promised to pay you. If it's okay with you, I hope it's okay with you, I am actually going to double your salary. Well, okay, I guess if you want to twist my arm, I guess that's okay. That's not what's happening here. Your boss comes to you and he says, here's what your wage is going to be. Payday comes, you look at your paycheck and what? It ain't what it's supposed to be. So you go back to your boss and say, listen, here's this paycheck. This isn't what we agreed upon. And the boss says, well, I changed our agreement. And you say an agreement requires you and me to agree on it. I didn't agree to this. And he says, no, it means that's what I've decided to do. And then the next month, you come back, you get your next paycheck, and you look at it, it's even less than that. And then 10 times you come back and your boss has done what? Lowered your wages. I don't know about you, but I'd be wanting to find me a different job. But it's that very struggle, church, that prepares Jacob's heart to be ready when at the right time God calls and says, get up, get out, go home. All right, we're out of time. I was having too much fun. Let's close with a prayer. Father, thank you so much for the time we spent together here in this class this morning. for this marvelous text that is Genesis chapter 31. Father, ultimately, all of us in this room are going to be called home. I think that's the most beautiful part of this, is that this world is not our home, but I know what it's like to become so comfortable with this home that is currently where I reside, this earth, that we don't yearn for heaven as much as we ought to. And so from time to time, you bring something into our life, kind of gets in our saddle and wakes us up and makes us realize how important it is to want to go home, ultimately to be with you. So, Father, I pray that we would all have our sights set ultimately on going home to be with you in heaven forevermore. But until that point, Father, help us to know that you are with us, that you will not forsake us or abandon us, and that whatever the struggles, the pitfalls that we face, the hard times, that you are not abandoning us in the moment of our affliction, but that you are with us and that you will lift us up from that state. And Father, even if it's not in this life, but in the next, we will be redeemed. So Father, I ask that you would go with us now as we leave this place. Be with each of us, keep us safe, give us the opportunity to continue to assemble with our brothers and sisters here at Waters Road. So Jesus, that we pray. Amen. Thank you, class.